Good morning, everybody. Welcome to class. Figured I'd start a minute early so we could say hello and chat a little bit. Coming to you from my cold office with my cold Bojangles coffee today. I hope everybody had a great weekend. Sure missed you. Hi, Michaela Whitaker. Good to see you. Talked to you a little bit this morning. Zoe, Mary, Mattress, Sky, Omar, Salah. It's great to see everybody. How y'all doing? First week of classes, all right? Hi, Yasmin. I hope everybody's done well. Hi, Luke. Good to see you as well. Wow, great class today. Looks like we got 15 people in here. Fantastic. Anybody do anything fun this weekend? Anything fun? I know there's nothing much fun to do these days. Seems like everything's closed down. Hi, Shailene. Good to see you. Fantastic. So today we're going to be talking about Chapter 2. Hi, Sarah. Good to see you. Ariel, fantastic. Wow, Ariel went roller skating. How 1980s is that? Wow, I used to do that when I was a kid. Do you have your own skates, or did you have to get the ugly brown rental skates like I do? Hi, Kenna. Fantastic, Alan. They're my own. Wow, fantastic. Very, very impressive. Oh, cool. What mountains did you go to, Omar? Hi, H. Sandy. Is it Sandy? Good morning, Jake. Good to see you. Fantastic. All right. Looks like it's 11 o'clock, so we probably ought to go ahead and get started. I do want to find out what mountains you went to, Jake. I'm definitely jealous of that. I love the mountains, my friend. Absolutely love them. Ooh, Sugar Mountain, you went skiing. Nice. Very, very nice. You know what? When I was in college, or no, actually, I take that back. I had just gotten out of college, and I moved up to Boone with my wife so she could finish college. And I worked at Sugar Mountain for two winters in the boot room, help fitting people for snow boots with their snow skis. Sugar Mountain's a nice place. Was there any snow there? Hopefully the skiing wasn't too bad. It's good to see you, Chloe. All right. Wow, we got a good crowd. Looks like we got 26 people, so let's go ahead and get started. We're talking about Chapter 2, Biological Psychology. If you remember from last week, I talked about the different subfields in psychology, and biopsychology was one of the subfields. So this week's chapter is all going to be about biopsychology. So this week we're covering the biopsychology subfield, okay? Remember, as we go on this semester, we're going to cover some of these different areas, these different subfields of psychology. In 2 weeks, we're going to be in developmental psychology. So we're going to be talking about how babies and adults develop. And then in Chapter 5, we're going to be talking about experimental psychology. So each week is going to be a different subfield of psychology. And this week is the biopsych subfield. And so we've got 2 lectures today. We're going to talk a little bit about we're going to sort of narrow in and talk about the basic building block of the nervous system, which is the neuron. And we're going to talk about the basic mechanism that helps neurons communicate, which is neurotransmitters. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the organization of the nervous system. Then I'm going to go over and give you a sort of an anatomy and physiology of the neuron lecture. We're going to talk a little bit about neurotransmitters. We're going to talk about neuromodulating drugs. And then we're going to talk about the endocrine system and hormone functioning. Okay? Fantastic. Good to see everybody. Now, we're going to be talking about how neurons work, and I'm going to try to explain it as best I can, but, you know, if we were in a lecture hall, I would be showing you videos that would kind of help explain and describe the things that I'm talking about. You may not 100% understand what I'm talking about today, and that's not because you're not smart. It's probably because I can't describe it as well as I should. So I have several videos for you that I think will be very useful in helping you try to understand what we're talking about today. So if you go into your resources folder this week, you'll see that there are some really short videos that will help describe what I'm talking about. So I highly recommend that you go into the resources folder and look at these videos. They will really help supplement, augment what I'm talking about today. If I could, I would even stream them during my lecture, but they are proprietary, so I can't share them. But I do encourage you to go look at them at your leisure. Okay, so let's first start and talk about the overall organization of the nervous system. So the nervous system is that part of your body which helps you communicate, organize, and respond to the environment that you find yourself in. So you've got a digestive system that helps you get nourishment into your body so that you've got energy to function. You've got your respiratory system that helps provide the oxygen, which is also the gasoline that runs your system. Today we're talking about the nervous system, which is the communication system that allows you to react to and respond to the environment around you. And so we're going to start out by talking a little bit about the organization of the nervous system. Hello, Rogue Snowball. I hope you're doing well today, although I don't know who a Rogue Snowball is, but it's good to have you. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the central nervous system. You see a picture right over here to I guess it would be to my right. You'll see the picture of the human being with the nervous system highlighted inside the outline of their body. You'll notice you have a brain, you have a spinal cord, and you have a bunch of peripheral nerves that go from your brain and spinal cord to the rest of your body. Now, I promise I do not want you to know all of the nerves listed here. Really, all I want you to know from this slide is the basic breakdown of the nervous system into central and peripheral. Now, we typically differentiate between the brain and spinal cord and all of the other nerves that are in your nervous system. The brain and the spinal cord make up the central nervous system. Okay, and we call them central because they are in charge. Okay, your brain controls your muscles, your organisms, and your higher mental processes. So anytime you think, anytime you perceive, as you're paying attention to my lecture right now, your brain is controlling that. Your heart is beating right now, and your lungs are breathing. That is controlled by your brain. It's the central nervous system. As you walk and as you talk, and I forget who it was that went, Ariel, as you roller skated this weekend, the cerebellum, which is the bottom part of your brain, was controlling your legs so that you could skate smoothly around the roller ring. That's the central, that's the brain, which is part of the central nervous system. Now, it turns out that your spinal cord is also a control center of your brain. Your spinal column controls your reflex responses. If you've ever been to the doctor and had them tap you on the knee and your leg kicks out, that is a reflex, and that reflex is controlled by your spinal column. Your spinal column controls simple reflex responses that you really don't need to think about. But those are what we would call your central nervous system. Now, all the blue nerves that you see, again, I don't want you to know any of these names of these blue nerves. That's for an advanced biopsych class. All of these other nerves are what we would call peripheral nerves. And they are the nerves that connect the rest of your body to your central nervous system. Okay, so there are nerves that go from your brain all the way down to your stomach and to your heart and to your lungs. These nerves that connect your brain to your internal organs, are called part of your peripheral nervous system. We call that the autonomic nervous system. We call it autonomic because it's automatic. You don't really think about your heart. You don't really have to think about your lungs, and you really don't have to think about your stomach unless it's upset, right? So the nerves that run from your brain to these organs are part of what we would call the autonomic nervous system. Think autonomic or automatic. And then there are other nerves that go to your muscles, so that if I want to, I can lift my arm, so that if I want to, I can scratch my shoulder, right? So that if I want to, I can walk around. These are what we would call the somatic nervous system. These are the nerves that control your musculature. Somatic, soma equals body. So think about it as your body nervous system. So all these blue nerves run to your spinal cord and up to your brain, and they are what we would call peripheral. Now, if any of you are in EMT or in EMT training, or if you plan on being a doctor, sometimes doctors talk about whether or not nerve damage is central or peripheral. Does the patient have peripheral nerve damage? That means one of these blue nerves is damaged. Or does the patient have central nerve damage? That means the brain or the spinal cord neurons are damaged. All right? So for the exam, I do want you to know that the brain and spinal cord are control centers, and all of these blue nerves are nerves that go to and from your brain and spinal column. Okay, well, I'm glad to know who you are, Isaac. You're not Rogue Snowball, although I have to admit, Rogue Snowball is kind of a cool nickname. I'd be curious to see where you use that, Isaac. Okay, fantastic. Now, the basic building block of the nervous system is called a neuron. Actually, you have these things called neurons and glial cells, and these are the building blocks of the nervous system. So if you go back to this, and you look at the brain, the spinal cord, and all these other nerves, they are created by 85 to 100 billion neurons and glial cells. And these neurons are present at birth, and they come in all shapes and sizes. If you look right below me, you'll see that we have sensory neurons, we have motor neurons, we have pyramidal neurons, and we have Bett cells. There are lots of different sizes and shapes of neurons, and these are information transmitters. They receive information from one part of your brain, and they transmit it via an electrical potential to another part of your brain. Some neurons are microscopic. Some neurons are actually 2 and 3 foot long. They come in all shapes and sizes, and their job is to communicate from one part of your body to the other part of your body. Now, you have 85 to 100 billion neurons, but you have 10 times as many glial cells. Glial, I think, is Greek for glue, and these glial cells are support cells for neurons. They speed up and make the communication. They make neurons work a little bit faster, and they're also responsible for cleaning up intracellular waste so that your neurons have a clear area to work in. Okay, so you've got glial cells, 10 times as many glial cells as neurons. And the neat thing about your glial cells is they actually develop after you're born, and the process that of creating them is called myelination. Anybody ever seen an infant baby? You ever notice how infant babies can't do a stinking thing? They can't walk, they can't talk, they can't really think, they can't control their emotions, which is why they cry. This is because babies don't have myelin tissue in their brain. And as your brain matures, really what happens is it's growing the glial cells that help these neurons function more efficient and more effectively. So you're born with all the neurons you're ever going to need, but what comes after you're born are the glial cells, which help your neurons function effectively. Okay? Oh, good deal. It's good to see you, Sandy. I didn't know you. I like the H. Sandy as well. You're more than welcome to come to class with your nicknames if you like, just as long as you promise to behave and be a good citizen on the YouTube broadcast, okay? Now, let's talk about neurons. Now, a neuron is different than a nerve. You folks have probably heard of nerves before, and you've probably heard the term neurons. A neuron is not a nerve. A nerve is a bundle of neurons, specifically one part of the neuron that we're going to talk about called the axon. So a nerve is a bundle of neurons, and typically you're going to see these nerves in the peripheral nervous system. If you have a bundle of neurons in your brain, it's actually not called a nerve, it's called a tract in nerves. And so a bundle of neurons, and if you look down there in the bottom right, you'll see a myelinated, stained microscopic picture of a nerve. And do you notice how there are lots of little blue dots? Those are all neurons. So those are a bundle of neurons, just like a bundle of wires. Or if you've ever seen a rope, and you know how a rope is composed of a bunch of strands of fiber, that's exactly what a nerve is. It's a bundle of neurons, specifically myelinated neurons. Welcome back, Will. It's good to see you. I missed you last week, but we are glad to have you back in class, okay? Now, let's think of nerves as, now neurons are one-way communicators. They only send information one way. So when I want to move my hand, I have a neuron that goes from my brain to my hand. That's a one-way road. Now the thing is, my brain can feel my hand, correct? So there's a one-way road with a neuron coming back from my hand to my brain. So the neuron or nerve that goes from my brain that moves my hand is called a motor nerve, all right, or an afferent. And the nerve that comes from my hand so that I can feel my hand coming back to my brain is called a sensory nerve, or we sometimes use the word efferent, afferent and efferent. Does that make sense to everybody so far? So you've got 85 to 100 billion neurons in your brain. Some of those neurons transmit information to another place. We call those sensory neurons. And some neurons cause a part of your body to move or act, and we call those motor neurons. So we typically talk about connections to different parts of the brain. And if a part of the brain is sending information out, we call it a motor neuron. If a part of your brain is receiving information from a sensory neuron, we say it's from another part of the brain. We call that a sensory pathway or an efferent pathway. Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. Now, you'll notice that we have these little blue dots, and they all seem to be wrapped. What you're looking at is a cross-cut of these neurons, and each of these axons becomes wrapped in a layer of fatty insulation. This fatty insulation is made up by, you guessed it, glial cells that grow and wrap around these neurons just like insulation. So if you've ever seen wires, speaker wires, stereo wires, electrical wires, you notice that all of these wires have a plastic coating around them. It's the same concept in the nervous system. You have this plastic coating or these glial coating around each one of your neurons. Can anybody tell me why we have the plastic coating around wires that you find in your house, stereo speaker wires, phone speaker wires? Anybody know why we have them? And what happens if you lose that plastic coating around a speaker wire? Does anybody know what happens? And I'm actually going to wait for the response. Holy cow, we've already lost a few people. Uh-oh, don't leave. For protection, Makala. Absolutely, so they don't short circuit, so they don't shock you, and so the electrical wire works. That's the exact same concept in your brain. Think of your brain is composed of 85 to 100 billion wires in the brain. And the reason it doesn't work is because none of these wires are insulated. But as these wires become insulated, they start working properly. And the process of developing this insulative fiber around your neurons is called myelination. Now, what you look at right here, as I said, neurons come in all kinds of different sizes and shapes, from microscopic to almost 3 foot long, and they come all crazy different kinds of shapes. But what you're looking down here at the bottom right is what we call the prototypical neuron. This is the neuron that every psychology teacher uses to teach what neurons do. Okay, so not all neurons look like this. Wow, awesome question, Omar. Awesome question. And there's a very good reason why we don't come with these glial cells around us. Here's the thing. Your big advantage, Omar, in the animal world is your brain and your smarts. If you think about it, you can't run very fast, you can't fly, you're not very strong, and you can't see at night. You're really one of the weaker animals in the animal kingdom. In fact, I would say a good-sized squirrel could probably kick your ass, Omar, right? We are not very strong. So why do we rule the world? Because we have these smart brains. We're devious. Maybe I can't beat up a saber-toothed tiger, but you, me, and 10 of our friends can come up with a devious plan to beat that saber-toothed tiger, right? So the bigger our brain is, the more intelligent and cunning we are. But there's a limitation on how big a brain can be at birth. And the reason is because if a head is too big, that baby can't get through the birth canal, okay, and be born. So something has to be left out of the brain in order for the baby to pass through the birth canal. So we come with all of our brain parts there, they're just not finished. And it's that myelin tissue that comes later. And in fact, when we talk about evolutionary psychology, one of the reasons that humans live in groups and that mothers and infants bond so well is it's evolutionarily adaptive, because the mother loves and takes care of the baby until that brain matures. Okay, so humans take a lot longer to mature than other animals because our brain is so big. And if you ever look at individual babies, you'll notice that their head is way bigger to their body than it will be when we're adults. So your head at birth is about a quarter of your body length. By the time you become an adult, your brain is only, your head is only 1/8 of your body's distance. Okay, and so something has to be left out of the brain. So it's this fatty tissue that is not there, and it's simply because it allows you to make it through the birth canal. Does that make sense, Omar? I'll go ahead and wait for your response. I hope that makes sense to you. Yasmin, just to clear it, glial cells create myelin. Glial cells are myelin, actually. Glial cells are myelin. And myelin tissue, as you see down here in this picture, myelin tissue is composed of tons and tons of glial cells that are wrapped together. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, that's a really good question, Omar. I like the way you're thinking. It is kind of crazy to think about. Wow, you folks are asking great questions today. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and I'm going to talk about the different parts of the neuron. I'm going to talk about the dendrites, the cell bodies, and the axon and the dendrites, or in the terminal buttons. So dendrites, cell body, axon, and terminal buttons. For the exam, I'm going to want you to know what each of these 4 parts of the neuron does. And you'll notice in this picture that I have down here, there's myelin sheath that grows along the outside of the axon. So you'll see the picture, there's an axon running, and it's kind of like a road or a root, if you will. And it's covered by this sausage-looking myelin sheath. And it's the myelin sheath that grows on the outside. Actually, Omar, one of the things you can do is you can pretty much age a person's brain by looking at internal brain images and seeing how developed the myelin tissue is. And myelin tissue actually develops in a very predictable pattern. The back part of the brain, which is for like vision and sensory experiences, if you'll notice, kids' sensory abilities develop first. They can see, they can hear, they can smell. And so that part of the brain is either myelinated at birth or myelinates soon after birth. And then if you'll notice, kids around the age of 2 begin to be able to walk, and by 4, 5, and 6, they can move around almost like adults. And that's because the motor areas myelinate. And one of the last parts of the brain to myelinate is the frontal lobe of the brain, where your decision, your judgment making, and your ability to sort of think and organize your behavior develops. And you know what? The frontal part of your brain actually isn't fully myelinated until in your mid-20s. And that's why teenagers sometimes have bad judgment and do things that they wish they hadn't done after the fact. And it's because different parts of the brain actually myelinate at different times. Okay? Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and I'm going to use this same picture, but I'm going to step through each time talking about the different parts of your brain. Now, I want you to understand an important point. Brains, oh my goodness. Oh, let's start with the dendrite. I'm sorry, this is the first picture. Your nervous system communicates electrochemically. It communicates via chemicals, which are secreted in your brain, and electrical potentials, which are generated because of the chemical secretions. All right? So a part of your brain will secrete a chemical. It will excite the dendrites of a neuron, and then those dendrites will communicate with the cell body that will then generate a brief pulse of electricity called an action potential. So that's sort of an overview. So you have these dendrites, these root-like structures. Do you see these branch-like structures? And each of these dendrites has thousands of little proteins that are shaped very uniquely, these protein receptor sites. And these protein receptor sites are kind of like a lock, and they respond to a very specially shaped chemical called a neurotransmitter. They don't respond to any other chemical except one that is shaped perfectly. So you have all of these different chemicals that are released in your brain, and if a chemical is released in the right place, it is picked up by these dendrite structures. And so your dendrites are branch-like structures that extend from your cell body, and they have these protein receptor sites that are sensitive to stimulation from molecules called neurotransmitters. Now, these molecules, these neurotransmitter molecules, sometimes they tell a neuron not to generate electricity. They are inhibitory. And sometimes these chemicals are excitatory. They tell the neurotransmitter to send an action potential. And so these thousands of dendrites, in a sense, they're having chemicals that are suffused on them. And what they do is they're taking all this chemical information, and some of this chemical information is saying, get excited. And some of this information is saying, become inhibited, don't get excited, all right? So your dendrites are kind of like polling stations, if you will, and the neurotransmitters are kind of like voters sending votes. Hey, get excited or get inhibited. I hope that makes sense, right? And you know, the thing is, children with Down syndrome actually have misshapen receptor sites on their dendrites, which is why they don't function as well. Instead of having these little buttons, they have sort of misshapen neurotransmitter receptor sites. Okay? Now, here's the deal. Your dendrites, you have thousands and thousands and thousands of them. And like I said, each one of them is a voting station that is receiving votes from chemicals called neurotransmitters. And these neurotransmitters are either saying get excited or don't get excited. Now, each one of these dendrites, then each one of these receptor sites sends its vote, as it will. And I hope that using this analogy doesn't make it seem too stupid, but if you think about it, this is sort of how it works. So each neuron is getting thousands of votes at any given time. Your cell body is kind of like the vote counter that decides what the message is going to be. If you get enough excitatory potentials, this cell body is going to tell the neuron to get excited and generate a pulse of electricity called an action potential. If the dendrites, on the other hand, receive enough inhibitory information, the cell body will quiet the neuron down. Does that make sense, folks? I'm looking here and I'm not sure if you're getting it. If you do, go ahead and type a yes in there. So your cell body contains the nucleus of the cell. And the nucleus of the cell does everything that a nucleus of a cell normally does. It does the basic biological activities of the cell, but it also decides whether or not that neuron is going to generate a pulse of electricity. There's actually a spot at the very base of the cell body called the axon hillock, which is not in your intro book, so we're not going to talk about it. And the axon hillock is where your neuron decides to either become depolarized and generate an action potential. All right? Now, that's the cell body. Now, if the cell body does decide to send an action potential, it sends it down this long root-like structure called an axon. And the axon is the part of the neuron that can be as long as 2 or 3 feet long. Some axons are super duper short. You have these little neurons called interneurons that are microscopic, but some motor neurons that run from your spinal column all the way, from your brain all the way down your spinal column, can be 3 feet long. And these long root-like projections, not protection, oh my God, long root-like projection from the cell body, and it connects that cell body to a different part of the nervous system. And it may be as long as 3 feet long. Now, I'm going to save the neurochemistry of the action potential for your biopsych class. But what happens is the outer membrane of your axon becomes depolarized, and positive and negative ions flow inside to out, or from inside to outside of the neuron, and generate a chemical depolarization, which turns into an electrical pulse. And this electrical pulse runs all the way from the axon hillock all the way to the end of the axon, to these things called terminal buttons. Now, I told you that glial cells speed up improve the functioning of the neuron. Basically, what they do is they speed up they increase the speed of the action potential as it runs down the length of the neuron. Okay, they actually cause it. You'll notice that the myelin sheath kind of looks like sausage, and you have little spots in between each of the sausage links. It actually causes this electrical pulse to sort of bounce from space to space to space, and what we call a saltatory connection. But that's not, I'm not going to talk to you about that class, that in this class. But basically, this myelin sheath causes your action potential to speed all the way down the length of the axon. The sodium-potassium pump, holy cow, Yasmin, somebody has been in an AP psychology class or an AP biology class. Absolutely, Yasmin. I'm going to give Yasmin a gold star for today. She has figured it out. I am so impressed with you, Yasmin. We're not going to cover that for this class. If we were in a seated class and I could really get into the details of it and I had the time, I might go into that. But we're just not going to have time, and this is not the right format for that. But yes, wow, super impressed. Sodium is a positive ion, potassium is a positive ion, and I think and they move across the membrane of the axon, and it generates this pulse of activity. You know, actually, we're going to talk about it on Thursday, but they actually have this brain measurement technique called a single cell recording technique. You can stick a thin microscopic electrode into a neuron, and you can actually listen to the sound of action potentials as they're occurring. And when a neuron starts to send an action potential, it sounds kind of like a Geiger counter. And you can actually hear when a neuron gets excited and starts generating action potentials. Now, an action potential is an all or nothing pulse of electricity. Once it starts, It goes all the way down the length of the axon, and it ends in the terminal buttons. All right? Now, here's a myelin sheath. Myelin sheath, as I said, it's the fatty coating on the axons of larger neurons, and it insulates the neuron and speeds up the action potential. There are actually diseases called demyelination diseases, which cause the myelin tissue along these axons to begin to disintegrate. I don't know if any of you have heard of amyolateral sclerosis, ALS syndrome, Lou Gehrig's disease. This is a demyelination disorder which causes the neurons to quit functioning properly. You folks are way too young to remember Christopher Reeve. He's the old Superman from the 1980s and 1990s. But he was Superman, and he developed Lou Gehrig's disease. And it basically makes it so that you can't walk and talk, and after a certain amount of time, it demyelinates the neurons that allow you to breathe and your heart to beat, and it causes you to die. So myelin tissue is very important for the functioning of neurons. Okay, now the picture right underneath me, what is a picture of a nerve. The yellow dots in the middle are the axons of neurons, and the gray stuff around them is the myelin tissue that develops after birth to help these neurons generate action potentials that move fastly. I just said fastly. Oh my God, move quickly. Now, when we get to chapter 5 and we talk about we talk about sensation and perception, we're going to talk about the thickness of nerves as determining how fast you get information from the periphery of your body to your brain. It turns out that pain nerves actually move quite slow, but proprioception or touch neurons move quite quickly. So you're going to feel the pain a little bit before the pain actually starts to hurt you. If you drop something on your hand, you're going to feel the touch before you feel the pain. And we'll talk about that in chapter 5 when we get to experimental psychology. Any questions so far, folks? We're 11:35. We're running not as early as I'd like, but I'm going to try to speed up. Now, this action potential travels all the way down the length of the axon and ends up in these terminal buttons. These little terminal buttons are the little bumps at the very end. You'll see them down here, and you see those sort of little explosion-looking things down here. There's 4 little explosion things going from what we call these presynaptic neuron to the postsynaptic neurons. So there are 2 neurons right here. You see the cell body over on the far left, and it goes all the way over here, and you have these terminal buttons, and they connect with the dendrites on the postsynaptic neurons. The terminal buttons is where the action potential ends up. When the action potential gets all the way to the terminal buttons, it causes the terminal button to release neurotransmitters. So remember at the beginning of this lecture, I told you that your dendrites are responsive to chemicals called neurotransmitters. You might ask, where do those neurotransmitters come from? Well, neurotransmitters are actually contained in the terminal buttons, in these little synaptic vesicles, these little buses, if you will, these little sacs that contain these chemicals. When an action potential gets all the way down to the terminal button, it causes the terminal button to depolarize, and it allows these little chemicals to flood from the terminal button into a little gap between the neurons called a synapse. These little chemicals float across the synapse, and they synapse on these receptor sites. If you look down below me, these blue objects are the proteins on the receptor sites, on the dendritic bumps. The red objects are the neurotransmitter molecules, and you'll notice how they are shaped to fit exactly into the receptor sites. And so when an action potential comes from one nerve all the way down the axon, one neuron all the way down the axon, it causes whatever neurotransmitters are in that terminal button to be released. Now, there are actually over 100 different types of neurotransmitters contained in different parts all over your brain. We're going to talk about those in just a minute. And whatever neurotransmitter happens to be in the terminal button is released when the action potential gets to the end of the terminal button. Then the action potential causes the terminal button to release the neurotransmitters, these chemical messengers, into the synapse. They float across the synapse and they send their message, or they cast their vote, if we go back to the analogy that I was using. Now, each neurotransmitter is allowed one vote. After it votes one time, it is sucked back up into the terminal button in a process called reuptake, neurotransmitter reuptake. And basically that is the process of sucking the molecules back into the terminal button after they are released. Now, not all of those neurotransmitters will be released, but you know what? You've got glial cells whose job is to clean up the last little bit of molecules out of the synapse. So not only do glial cells insulate axons, but their job is also to help clean up this little space between two neurons. Now, it's kind of crazy. You have 100 billion neurons, but none of them actually touch one another. They are very close together, but there is a space, so no two neurons actually touch. They have a little space in between them. And the neurotransmitter communicates between one neuron and another. Does everybody understand that? Does that make sense so far? Now, neurotransmitters. I told you that neurons communicate electrochemically. Now let's talk about the chemical part of that communication. Neurotransmitters are molecules that are released from neurons that communicate with other neurons. There are about 100 different types of neurotransmitters, but really 7 of them do about 95% of the work. So I'm not going to talk about all the different kinds of neurotransmitters. We'll leave that for your biopsychology or for your anatomy class or for medical school, for those of you who are going to be doctors, nurses, and all those other great healthcare professionals. There are about 7 neurotransmitters. Some of them are excitatory, some of them are inhibitory. Most of them can be excitatory or inhibitory depending upon where they're released. So have you folks ever heard of adrenaline? You probably have heard of, or excuse me, let's talk about it. Let's talk about norepinephrine, noradrenaline. Now, adrenaline, if that neurotransmitter is released in your peripheral nervous system around your heart, it causes your heart to start beating fast. So adrenaline is excitatory in your peripheral nervous system. However, if adrenaline is released in your frontal lobe, it's actually inhibitory. So neurotransmitters, some of them are excitatory, some of them are inhibitory, but most of them, their effect depends upon where in the nervous system they are released. Okay? Now, for your test, I want you to be familiar with these 7 different types of neurotransmitters. Now, acetylcholine is important for attention and motor control, memory, and learning, and it's related to sleeping. Acetylcholine, I'm probably going to ask you if it's related to attention or memory. So what I'll probably do on the homework or the exam is have a matching question. Acetylcholines for motor control, attention, and memory. Norepinephrine is a neurotransmitter that's responsible for arousal and alertness. Serotonin is a mood regulator. I guarantee most of you have heard of serotonin and its relationship to depression. Serotonin is related to emotional states. Dopamine is very important for reward and motivation. If you do addictive drugs, those addictive drugs probably operate on your dopamine system, and so it's where your reward and motivation center is. Okay. GABA is mostly an inhibitory neurotransmitter, and it's responsible for maintaining anxiety. So if you're an anxious person, you probably have low levels of GABA in your nervous system. Glutamate is also responsible for learning and memory, and endorphins are your pain, or sort of your pain killing neurotransmitter in your brain. If any of you are joggers or long distance runners, and you've ever heard of the runner's high. So when you go jogging, at first you're hurting and you're painful, but if you run long enough, you actually start to feel good. That runner's high is caused by a release of endorphins in your nervous system. So for the test, I would like for you to be familiar with these 7 neurotransmitters. Acetylcholine, motor control and attention. Norepinephrine, arousal and alertness. Serotonin, mood control. Dopamine, reward and motivation. GABA, anxiety reduction. Glutamate, memory and learning. And endorphins, your internal painkiller. I'd like for you to be familiar with these 7 neurotransmitters. And you know what? We're going to talk about them over the course of this semester. We're going to go back and revisit most of these neurotransmitters from time to time over the course of this semester. Okay? Just a couple of general notes. Remember from slide 3 that neurons are all one-way communicators. They are either afferent, motor neurons, or efferent, sensory neurons. When an action potential, that little brief pulse of electricity, is created, it's all or nothing. An action potential will travel all the way down the length of an axon, and it will lead to neurotransmitter release from a terminal button. Remember that neurotransmitters may be either excitatory or inhibitory. They may cause the next neuron to send an action potential, or they may inhibit the next neuron from sending an action potential. And the generation of an action potential depends upon how many neurotransmitters are released on a given neuron. If a given neuron gets more excitatory neurotransmitters than inhibitory neurotransmitters, it will generate a pulse of electrical activity. If the neuron gets more inhibitory neurotransmitters than excitatory neurotransmitters, it will be inhibited and it won't generate an action potential. Okay? Now, there are psychoactive drugs. I don't know if any of you folks are taking drugs for anxiety disorders, or if any of you are taking drugs for depression. I don't know if any of you have ever smoked a joint or drank some alcohol. All of these are what we would call psychoactive drugs because they're small enough to pass through the blood-brain barrier and get into the little synapse, and they happen to be shaped just like neurotransmitters, so they work like neurotransmitters. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of a rattlesnake or chemical warfare or a black widow spider. These are all examples of neurotoxins. Black widow spiders, their venom has what we call latrotoxin, which is a very strong neurotoxin which affects how neurotransmitters work in your nervous system. And all of these things, psychoactive drugs like medical drugs, recreational drugs, or poisons that you may ingest, are all called neurotoxins because they modulate how your neurotransmitters in your nerves function. Now, there are 2 basic kinds of psychoactive drugs, and we're going to class them as either being agonists or antagonists. So, a psychoactive drug that magnifies the effect of a neurotransmitter is called an agonist. And that's a drug that magnifies the effect of a neurotransmitter. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And SSRI magnifies the amount of serotonin in your synapses. Okay? So when you take an SSRI, what it does is it prevents your body from reuptaking the serotonin that's in your synapses, so that serotonin, you get an overdose of the serotonin that you have in your brain. And this helps elevate your mood, because if you don't have enough serotonin, you get depressed. So an SSRI, the depression medication, works by magnifying the amount of serotonin in your brain so that you feel better. Okay? Now, if any of you have ever seen a person with schizophrenia, have a family member who suffered from schizophrenia, they take what we call, they take a dopamine antagonist. And an antagonist is a drug that minimizes the effect of, or works against the effect of, a neurotransmitter. The first psychoactive medical drug that was ever invented was invented in the 1950s. It was called Thorazine. And Thorazine works as a dopamine antagonist to reduce the amount of dopamine in your nervous system, which reduces the severity of schizophrenic hallucinations. Everybody following me so far? I'm just about done. Finally, the last thing. It turns out that neurotransmitters work very locally and they work very quickly. So all the neurotransmitters that I've talked about are released from one neuron and travel just a short distance and really quickly affect the functioning of the neuron right next to the neuron that releases the neurotransmitter. But you also have an endocrine system, which is a system that releases neurotransmitters, or what we'll call hormones, which is a kind of it works just like a neurotransmitter, but a hormone, instead of working locally and quickly, a hormone works systematically and affects the functioning in large parts of your nervous system. It works slower instead of fast, and it works systemically instead of locally. We're not going to talk about hormones too much in this chapter, but when we get to chapter 11 and we're talking about stress, the fight or flight response and the negative effect of stress, I'm going to talk about the effect that cortisol, the release of cortisol, has on your nervous system. Because cortisol is a stress hormone that causes neurons to become excited. And cortisol is part of the stress response function, and it prepares you for fighting and flight. Cortisol causes your heart to start beating fast. It causes your lungs to start working faster. And cortisol prepares your entire system to fight if you need to. And we're going to talk more about the endocrine system and hormones in chapter 11. Okay, that's about all I have to say. Do we have any questions for today's lecture? Is there anything I can answer before I let you go, folks? Okay, thank you very much for spending 50 minutes with me today. I hope you have a great day. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to send me a text. I've got my phone here for a remind, or you can send me an email. But remember, our next lecture is going to be on Thursday this week because I've got a doctor's appointment all day tomorrow. So I will see you on Thursday. And next week, we will go back to the Monday and Wednesday lectures. Just this week, we're Tuesday and Thursday. But I will see you next week, Monday and Wednesday, all right? So until Thursday at 11 a.m., I'd like to go ahead and say goodbye. It's great to see you, and have a great day.